Well, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Jayne Gaskin? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. In the 1990s, a Greek man named Peter Sokos traveled to Nicaragua with an interest in buying islands in the Pearl Keys. This group of 18 islands is about 22 miles from Pearl Lagoon on Nicaragua's Mosquito Coast. Peter contacted an attorney in the port town of Bluefields and approached several people who had claims to the islands. The islands had been sold by the government to individuals about 100 years earlier, so there was a long history of private ownership. Eventually, Peter purchased 7 of the islands, although some of the locals accused him of being manipulative in the way he went about it. In 1999, Peter launched a website called tropicalislands.com and initially listed 5 of the islands for sale. The cheapest island was listed for $105,000, which was an attractive price for those in the market for a private island. This is where Jayne Gaskin enters the story. Jayne was a former Playboy bunny who lived in a 4-bedroom house in Stockbridge, England, about 20 miles north of Southampton. She and her partner Phil were raising 3 children, ranging in age from 8 to 13. Phil was an interior decorator who had his own business. Jayne described herself as a housewife who was tired of the rat race. After looking at Peter's website, Jayne became very excited about buying an island. She and Phil visited Nicaragua and eventually made a deal with Peter. In 2000, the couple purchased one of the islands called Lime Key for £170,000. The island was 9.5 acres. It was full of trees and other vegetation, surrounded by a thin line of white sand. Jayne renamed the island from Lime Key to Junique, like a combination of her name and the word unique. I will continue to refer to the island as Lime Key. Jayne and Phil sold their house and moved their family into an apartment in preparation for moving to Lime Key. To manage financially on their new island, the plan was to build a scuba diving resort. As all this was going on, there was a reality show on Channel 4 in Britain called No Going Back, which was about people who moved away from Britain. The producers became interested in Jayne's story and decided to make a standalone documentary about the family's adventure. In January 2001, Jayne, Phil, and the children flew to Nicaragua to begin their magical adventure. A Channel 4 film crew was with them to work on the documentary. The crew would continue to visit the island on occasion over the next several months. Lime Key was not easy to access. After arriving in the capital of Nicaragua, the group had to take a 1-hour flight to Bluefields, then take a 2-hour trip in a small boat to Pearl Lagoon. From this point, they could take a 25-foot boat that they purchased to their island. Jayne painted this boat pink. They also bought a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. They had heard that the area was dangerous, as drug runners would sometimes stop in the Pearl Keys to hide or rest. When Jayne and her family finally arrived in their new home, they were hit with a heavy dose of reality. There was only one structure on the island, a small shack, which of course did not have electricity or plumbing. There was a source of fresh water on the island in the form of a well. The family also had a generator, so they could run some electrical devices, including lights for the shack. The fresh food that the family purchased before their arrival quickly went bad, and they ran out of gas. For the most part, the family lived on rice and a large quantity of beans. Perhaps this was part of a plan to produce their own gas. Phil didn't really seem to know anything about construction, yet this adventure was essentially a construction project. He planned on building 6 cabanas and a restaurant on the island. Only £50,000 had been set aside for the project, so money was tight. Phil and Jayne hired several construction workers and a couple of cooks with the intent of completing the scuba diving resort in a year. One of the workers was a former guerrilla fighter named Teodoro Tinoco. He not only performed construction work, he was the driver of the family's boat. Apparently, Teodoro was open to other types of activity as well. For example, he started having an affair with Jayne. Apparently unsatisfied, he also became romantically involved with one of the cooks. In what appears to be a highly hypocritical move, Jayne was displeased with Theodora cheating on her and kicked him off the island. He came back a while later looking for his job, only to be rejected again. This would not be the last time that he visited the island. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On September 23, 2001, Theodora and 4 other perpetrators landed on Lime Cay armed with AK-47 rifles. They confronted the family members and 2 of the workers and placed them in the family's boat, declaring that they were being kidnapped for ransom. The price was $1 million. Apparently, Theodora believed that the family had this kind of money, but this assumption was inaccurate. The perpetrators tied their boat to the family's boat and set off from the island. The attackers were wearing masks, but the family members recognized the voice of Theodora. Phil didn't say anything because he feared that it would guarantee his own murder. The boat became stalled by silt because the attackers drove it too close to shore. They incorrectly believed that the boat had run out of fuel, so they started putting gas in the tank. As this was happening, Phil decided to make a daring move. He grabbed a gas container and poured gas on one of the attackers. The other perpetrators simply stared at him. Nobody fired a weapon at this time. Phil lit a match and threw it, igniting the attacker he had covered in gasoline, as well as another attacker. In the process, Phil's left arm caught fire. The family and the helpers jumped off the boat and swam to a nearby swamp as the attackers opened fire. Concealed in vegetation, the family remained safe until they were rescued by a passing fishing boat. Theodora and the rest of his gang were arrested, but all the charges were dismissed. A judge ruled that the witnesses against them were unreliable because they worked for Phil and Jayne. So I guess the judge wasn't counting Phil, Jayne, or their children as witnesses. After the attack, Phil was traumatized and even received special permission from the government to carry a firearm on his person at all times. He developed symptoms of depression and had severe asthma attacks. After a long debate and several family votes, Phil and Jayne eventually decided to sell Lime Cay. The plan was to look for another island in a more developed area, or to start a company that bred exotic reptiles for collectors. As Phil's asthma became worse, the family left the island and moved to Bluefields to be closer to medical services. In December 2001, Phil died from a massive asthma attack. Fatalities from asthma are rare, but I imagine that Phil did not receive great treatment. It's also possible that he had other medical problems or his condition was inaccurately reported. Phil was buried on a snake farm owned by a friend of Jayne's. Of her late husband, Jayne said, "I'll never be able to replace him." Not long after his death, the No Going Back documentary was released, which left viewers both mortified and intrigued. A follow-up documentary was released a few months later. Jayne sold Lime Cay to a British woman and purchased another island in the Pearl Keys, which she named Pink Pearl. She eventually listed this island for sale as well. Jayne and her family moved back to England. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. In addition to the physical dangers, Jayne and Phil had to worry about legal challenges to their ownership of Lime Cay. The locals viewed the Pearl Keys as public property. For the most part, the islands were unoccupied, but people frequently visited them. They didn't like the idea of a family living on one of those islands. The mayor of Pearl Lagoon said the islands could not be loaned or given away. Rather, there was a sacred entitlement that must be passed down from generation to generation. The president of Nicaragua visited the island with an army of reporters. He told the residents that he would help them reclaim the islands. Jayne and Phil did not seem to understand the level of corruption in Nicaragua. It is one of the most corrupt governments in the world. They tried appealing to officials with reason, when bribes may have been what was expected. Jayne stated that she was not going to walk away from the island. She said, quote, "I want the island. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. That's what it would be, all-out war," unquote. It appears as though Jayne was making a reference to the movie Apocalypse Now, which ironically is an outcome the locals wished upon her. Later, Jayne may have gained some understanding about corruption When she was talking about the locals, she referred to them as untrustworthy and said they could be bought for beer and cigarettes. Item number 2. Prior to the kidnapping, it appears as though Jayne was having an affair with Theodora. A discussion between the two of them was captured in the documentary, in which Jayne essentially admits to the affair. This discussion occurred while Jayne was standing in front of him topless, which is something that she often did on the island. Maybe Jayne wasn't worried about Phil's feelings, or perhaps they had some type of arrangement. I guess it's also possible that she didn't think Phil would ever see the documentary, considering they didn't have a television. After the kidnapping, Jayne and Phil had a substantial difference of opinion and appeared to drift apart. Jayne wanted to go back to the island, believing it represented freedom. Phil viewed the island as a prison and mentioned how there was no one to talk to. He indicated how he realized that he was much different from Jayne, saying that she did not need people, but he did. It would appear as though Phil had his epiphany a little too late to save his own life. Item number 3. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Like many couples, Jayne and Phil had their share of problems. Unlike many couples, they attempted to escape their problems by purchasing an island. There were a few different motives behind this purchase. For example, disagreements the couple had with Jayne's parents, a sizable mortgage on their house, and other debt. Their solution to having money problems was to spend £170,000 to buy an island and £50,000 to build a resort. Apparently, they chose to ignore the fact that their plan to make money on the island was half-baked at best. Even if they could have generated revenue, they didn't budget anywhere near enough for construction. There is the sense that Jayne and Phil were truly clueless as to what was required to live on an island, much less to build and manage a resort. They left most of the comforts of the modern world behind and embarked on a construction project in an area with hostile locals, a monsoon season, armed gang members, excessive quantities of insects, and a corrupt government which jeopardized their ownership of the island and did not prosecute the people who kidnapped them and their workers. Jayne and Phil jeopardized their own safety and the safety of their children in a ludicrous attempt to chase their dreams. Instead of traditional school, Jayne was the children's tutor. Instead of traditional recreation, the children resorted to racing hermit crabs. It must have been a miserable existence. The probability of success that Jayne and Phil had from the beginning was just about zero. The best they could hope for was to get out alive, which, unfortunately, one of them was not able to do. When looking at the danger this family was in all the time they were there, including the kidnapping, it's truly amazing that any of them survived. Those are my thoughts in the case of Jayne Gaskin. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.